Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 54, and there is a huge amount to pack into this episode. We haven't recorded one for 2 to 3 weeks, and we really do need to catch up on the extraordinary amount of news that is taking place in Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. Before you look at this, please do check that you are subscribed so you don't miss out on any of these news content or interviews. And please also check out Silicon Wafers, our new channel, which is going to be featuring a whole range of daily deep dive updates, short, compact videos containing tons of information about specific stories to do with the war and to do with Russia's descent into chaos. We start with a number of stories that relate to the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, invasion, or my preferred term, offensive. Ukraine can now decide how to use Spanish-supplied equipment, says the Spanish defense minister. That's been reported in the Kyiv Independent on August 16th. Ukraine can determine how and when to use Spanish-supplied equipment, explained the Spanish defense minister Margarita Robles during her visit to the NATO Rapid Deployment Corps in Spain. Her comment comes amid Ukraine's ongoing incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast, and a similar statement was actually made by the Canadian defense minister, saying Ottawa does not have any geographical restrictions for the use by Ukraine of Canadian donated tanks and armored vehicles, including on the territory of Russia. This is a war, and therefore Ukraine will use whatever material it deems necessary at any given time, said Margarita, emphasizing the equipment provided to Ukraine by Spain is defensive. Similarly, Germany seems to be getting over their initial fears of seeing German-made Leopard tanks in operation on Russian territories in Kursk. Sometimes history can provide ironies so rich that they make memes redundant. These statements from Spain and the implied statement from Germany increasingly jar with the caution being showed by Biden's administration in Washington. Reports continue to swirl that the US is effectively blocking Ukraine from firing British Storm Shadow missiles on targets within mainland Russia, mirroring its own restrictions on the use of highly effective long-range weapons against strategic military targets on Russia's territory, for instance, with ATACMS. These bases are used not only to hit Ukrainian cities, civilians, and infrastructure, but also degrade Ukraine's military and quite possibly limit the scope and effectiveness of operations such as the Kursk offensive. The US has defined and imposed safe zones for Russian killing hardware, where they have impunity to murder Ukrainians and can expect no repercussions for their actions. There are long-range drones, of course, but these neither have the scale nor the speed to take out the Russian military bases and aircraft in a highly agile and timely way. The US policy has created a safe space for murder by Russians. The Eurasian Times dives into the detail of these restrictions. Washington is effectively blocking Britain's request for Kyiv to employ Storm Shadow missiles against targets within Russian territory, according to reports. This move comes amidst the Biden administration's apprehensions about so-called escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. In fact, we hear administration spokespeople use this phrase in almost every address that they give, which is a dead giveaway for the coercive control Russians seem to have over them and their advisors. Despite repeated appeals from Ukraine, the US has imposed restrictions on the use of long-range weaponry such as ATACMS and Storm Shadow. These restrictions appear to have the primary aim of preventing deep strikes inside Russia, a strategy intended to avoid further apparent escalation, ignoring the extraordinary fact that Ukraine now occupies apparently around 1,500 kilometers of Russian territory, and the world has not ended. Russia simply fires into Ukrainian cities in a display of impotent, terroristic gestures and rage, As we know, this major incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast has resulted in Ukrainian forces taking control of substantial portions of two districts within those regions, and there is speculation that these incursions are partly to convince the US and allies that there are no serious or world-ending repercussions for fighting back against Russia. And, of course, avoiding the weakness of being militarily unpredictable. British officials suspect that the US is waiting to evaluate the impact of Ukraine's actions in the Kursk Oblast before making a final decision on long-range strike capabilities. Whether this is a decision-making process delay within the sclerotic US bureaucratic system or intentional, the result is the same. It means that Ukraine's momentum is blunted and the scope of their gains is curtailed. It makes the incursion less of a threat for Russia and returns the fight to something more predictable that the managerial mindset of the administration is more comfortable with. But alas, this makes no military sense at all. This time, however, I don't think Ukraine is so willing to be held back, because this is a fight for their lives, and the Kursk offensive may be their last roll of the dice for victory. An unnamed representative from the Defense Committee of Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada indicated the restrictions imposed by Western allies had compelled Ukraine to conduct operations on Russian soil in the first place. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly sought permission to use American ATACMS and British Storm Shadow missiles for strikes deep within Russia, but has been consistently denied. The Storm Shadow missiles, with a range of up to 250 kilometers, can target military installations deep within Russia that are vital to Moscow's military efforts in Ukraine. Sabrina Singh, deputy spokesman for the Pentagon, acknowledged during a recent briefing that the US is concerned about the potential for escalation should Ukraine deploy long-range weaponry. Singh also suggested that such weaponry might not be necessary for Ukraine to achieve its objectives of liberating its territory. But what she didn't admit, but which is patently true to every military expert, that denying this long-range capability means more Ukrainian civilians will die in a safe space, a killing zone enabled by US policy. It also means that Ukraine will lose more military personnel than it needs to achieve its military objectives. The US has reportedly opted against permitting the deployment of ATACMS, Army tactical missile systems, for attacks in Kursk. However, the stated reason is concerns over the restricted availability of these long-range weapons. This sounds like the same bureaucratic excuse given by Germany for not providing ATACMS, an excuse that is undermined by the fact that no contracts have been issued to scale up production of Taurus, for instance. If they are in short supply, then why not even start to make more of them, even if that production will take several years to be completed? The administration has maintained that it was not given prior notice of the assault and has reiterated that Washington has nothing to do with it. The Institute for the Study of War also noted Ukrainian forces are reportedly using Western-provided equipment in Kursk Oblast, but remain limited in their ability to strike Russian military targets within Russia with Western-provided weapons. It remains uncertain when the US will approve Ukraine's use of the British weapon system to strike Russian territory, but the US has already modified its self-imposed restrictions on military aid to Ukraine, as has been seen with the provision of F-16 fighter jets, ATACMS, and Abrams tanks. This pattern of gradually expanding support suggests that similar exemptions might eventually be considered for British armaments to target Russian territory. That such delaying behavior has made many of Ukraine's actions highly predictable throughout this war, negating one of the key elements of successful military strategy: surprise and chaos. In Kursk, Ukraine has achieved this, but can it sustain it without the full backing of allies? Allies that need to shift their mindset from maintaining the status quo to really helping Ukraine to defeat Russia comprehensively. The story in Politico continues the same theme. Ukraine seeks an end to restrictions on American weapons after the children's hospital attack, including the use of long-range ATACMS to hit inside Russia. Ukraine plans to ramp up pressure on the Biden administration during the NATO summit, which has recently passed, to lift all restrictions on using American-supplied weapons in Russian territory, said Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his advisor Andrei Yermak. However, the US administration remained unmoved and this permission was not given. This remains one of the White House's final remaining red lines on the Ukraine war, and the pressure campaign comes after the appalling missile strike hit the Children's Cancer Hospital in Kyiv last month. The Hill goes into the same story, but on a different angle. The Hill provides more details. President Biden affirmed a limit on how Ukraine can use American-provided weapons to strike inside Russia, just hours after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the restrictions crazy. While the US has permitted Ukraine to strike beyond the Russian border near the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, Biden has resisted Ukrainian demands to reach Russian targets as far as 300 miles across the border. This now seems even more absurd as Ukrainian forces press deeper into Russian territory with their forces actually on the ground. Biden defended the position, saying, "I'm following the advice of the Chief of Staff of the military, as well as the Secretary of Defense and my intelligence people, and we're making a day-to-day assessment on the basis for how far they should go in allowing these capabilities." But in talking to many former military commanders on this channel, none of them think this policy makes any military sense whatsoever. And the caution exhibited by the Biden administration is much more likely driven by political concerns, not strategic ones. Unfortunately, other countries like Germany follow America's lead and hold back. There has been a clear decision, said the Germans, and the American president said it again and again, that the weapons should not be used outside of Ukrainian territory. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said during a press conference following the NATO summit that has just passed. Scholz, of course, is quite happy to follow rather than lead, and the US provides the perfect cover for his caution, timidity, and lack of long-term thinking about security. If we want to win, if we want to prevail, if we want to save our country and to defend it, we need to lift all these restrictions, Zelensky said at that press conference. He called it crazy to have limitations on how it can use the donated weapons to strike back against the aggressor, Russia. We understand from what military bases they attack us, and if they attacked us and killed our children in the hospital, it's crazy why we can't answer back and attack those same military bases, where from these bases guided bombs from jets or missiles come, targeting us and killing our children, Zelensky said. It is hard to argue with his statement. And all of these restrictions make this next story seem rather odd. The Kyiv Independent reports that the US is considering sending Ukraine its first long-range cruise missiles this autumn, sources claim, again outside the time frame when they are likely to be maximally useful in, for instance, the Kursk offensive. Apparently, Biden's administration is open to supplying Kyiv with long-range cruise missiles to bolster its F-16 fighter jets. Talks between Ukraine and the US President Joe Biden's administration about supplies of long-range cruise missiles are in advanced stages, a source close to President Volodymyr Zelensky's administration said. The timeline of when the missiles could arrive in Ukraine is still unclear. What is clear is that the US continues to signal in a blatant way most of its upcoming actions, giving Russia advanced warning of any changes in support for Ukraine and removing the element of surprise. The phrase "considering" also creates such ambiguity that it must be a nightmare for Ukrainian military planners to figure out when they will be getting various capabilities and therefore make concrete plans dependent on their deployment. The US has not made a decision about the missile deliveries, but is working out those complicated details, Politico reported, citing one Biden administration official. Those details include reviews of the transfer of sensitive technologies and ensuring Ukraine's jets can launch the 2,400-pound, around 1,089-kilogram missile that carries a 1,000-pound or 454-kilogram warhead, according to that same media outlet. According to Politico, the US is considering providing Ukraine with JASM missiles, which can be launched over 200 miles, nearly 322 kilometers, from fourth-generation F-16s. If delivered to Ukraine, JASMs developed by Lockheed Martin would be the last class of munition that the US has banned from being supplied to Kyiv. JASM missiles can significantly boost the combat capabilities of F-16s, as in that case, they're not expected to fly close to the border with Russia because of the risk of being shot down, so they would dramatically extend the offensive capabilities of those F-16s. And why are all these munitions and increased capabilities so important for Ukraine? The next several stories illustrate exactly why. Russian attacks against Ukraine killed 4, injured 17 over the past day, reports the Kyiv Independent. Ukrainian air defense downed all 11 Shahed-type kamikaze drones launched by Moscow overnight from the Kursk and Primorsko-Akhtarsk directions in Russia, the Air Force reported. In Donetsk Oblast, Russian attacks killed 3 people and injured 9 over the past day, Governor Vadim Filashkin reported. In Sumy Oblast, 1 person was killed and 3 injured, including an 11-year-old child, during airstrikes against the Bielophilia community on August 18th. The same day, another civilian was injured during the bombing of the Yunakivka community, the regional military administration reported. Cherkasy, Dnipropetrovsk, Kyiv, Luhansk, Vinnytsia, Mykolaiv, and Zaporizhia oblasts all came under attack, but no casualties reported. Another key article looks at the picture over the entire week in the wake of Ukraine's attack on Kursk. The Russian response has the character of terroristic revenge attacks rather than anything that makes military sense. Russia used over 40 missiles, 750 guided bombs against Ukraine this week, Zelensky said in a speech in front of the first General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon received by Ukraine. This includes a combined missile and drone attack on Kyiv in the early morning of August 18th, involving North Korean ballistic missiles, as reported by the Kyiv City Military Administration. The attack was repelled without casualties. Russia always knows where its missiles and bombs hit. This is deliberate, targeted terror, Zelensky wrote on his Telegram channel. Guided aerial bombs, while having a shorter range than missiles, are cheaper to produce and are launched from aircraft within Russian territory, beyond the reach of Ukrainian air defense and HIMARS. These bombs have had a devastating impact on both the battlefield and residential areas, damaging Ukrainian frontline positions and aiding Russia's advance during the Kharkiv offensive in May 24. Civilian casualties from guided bomb attacks are frequently reported in areas near the Russian border, such as Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Sumy oblasts. There are also some advances in Kursk, with the Kyiv Independent reporting that a second and maybe even a third key bridge has been destroyed in Russia's Kursk Oblast by Ukrainian forces operating there. On Telegram, Mykola Aleshchuk, an Air Force commander, published a video showing what he described as a precise airstrike on the structure. The Air Force's aviation continues to deprive the enemy of logistical capabilities with precise airstrikes, significantly impacting the course of fighting, he said. Although the military did not specify the bridge's location, it's thought to be a bridge over the Siem River near the village of Zvanaya. It is also claimed that US-supplied HIMARS missiles were used in the attack. Ukraine aims to create buffer zones in Kursk Oblast and destroy as much of the Russian war potential as possible, Zelensky said in his evening address on August 18th. Today, we achieved good and much needed results in destroying Russian equipment near Toretsk. It is now our primary task in defensive operations overall to destroy as much Russian war potential as possible, he added. In particular, this is the creation of a buffer zone on the territory of the aggressor. We've already expanded and will continue to expand the circle of those who support a just end to this war. It's essential that Ukraine enters this autumn even stronger than before. Zelensky's appeal comes while Russian troops continue their advance near Pokrovsk and Terezk in the Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian soldiers on the ground say they are critically lacking manpower, ammunition, and military equipment, making the defense of Ukrainian-held cities more difficult than ever. This means that the Kursk offensive is a vital gamble, but one which cannot be allowed to fail in case Ukraine starts to experience losses on both fronts. It's also critical that allies accelerate the refinancing of Ukraine's budget from promised funds and distribute frozen Russian assets. Delays in US military aid have contributed dramatically to Ukraine's soaring budget deficit this year, as well as the slow pace of disbursement of a $50 billion loan to finance military spending. The group of 7 G7 leaders on June 13th confirmed an agreement on a plan to provide Ukraine with $50 billion loan by the end of the year. The loan would be repaid using interest from some of the $300 billion frozen in Russian assets. But as ever, things are proceeding at a glacial pace, placing war-torn Ukraine under ever more stress. Now, for the second half of this Silicon Bytes episode, here's a rundown of stories you may find interesting. More coverage of the Kursk campaign will appear tomorrow in a Silicon Wafers episode published first on the main channel as a teaser. The Kyiv Independent has published an incredible article detailing the first 10 days of Ukraine's Kursk incursion, from first shot to dozens of settlements captured. The link is provided in the video's description. Ukrainian forces enter Belgorod Oblast as the Kursk incursion continues. The Kyiv Independent provides details about the ongoing incursion into Belgorod as the Kursk attack continues to garner the most attention. Ukrainian troops have apparently entered Russia's Belgorod Oblast during the ongoing incursion into Kursk, Ukrainian media reported, based on a video published on the morning of August the 10th. In the video posted by Ukrainian media, 5 uniformed men with blue taped armbands are standing outside the building as one of them says, "I wish your health." The 252nd Battalion is in the village of Parozh, Belgorod Oblast. Glory to Ukraine. The soldiers in the video held the battalion's flag and a Georgian flag, and the sign on the building behind them reads Parovozhky Village Club. More stories that I'm going to give a quick run through of. Ukraine hits 4 Russian air bases in the largest such attack, sources say. Ukrainian long-range drones hit 4 Russian air bases overnight on August 14th in the largest attack on airfields in the war. A source in the Security Service of Ukraine told the Kyiv Independent earlier the same day Russia claimed it had downed over 110 Ukrainian drones in a massive strike, with local telegram channels reporting explosions at the Zavoslyka, Borisakhlebsk, and Voronezh, Baltimore air bases. And here's another story. Thousands flee as Russian troops take one Donetsk Oblast village after another. The Kyiv Independent takes a deep dive into the experiences of Ukrainians on the ground as Russian troops advance towards their main goal, Pokrovsk. But now, Novoradivka, Selidove, and Petrivka are becoming well known in Ukraine as they are stuck between the Ukrainian lines and the advancing Russians. For the thousands of civilians living under the constant threat of Russian fire, life has become unsustainable, but leaving is not always an option. This is a compelling and very moving article, which I highly recommend. Another moving long read in the Kyiv Independent looks at how to memorialize Ukraine's fallen soldiers. One warrior has asked to be cremated so future fighters don't dig trenches in our bones. Konstantin Yuzvyuk is one of the latest prominent Ukrainian soldiers killed in Russia's war who chose a non-traditional burial, inspiring Ukrainians to fight on. This is an incredible article about heroism, but also the poignancy of sacrifice. Well, now turning from noble truth to ignoble lies. The Nord Stream sabotage is making headlines again. Donald Tusk tells German politicians, the main patrons of Nord Stream, to apologize and keep quiet. The debate and the dubious stories that have appeared in the German media have reignited fears that Germany is moving away from confronting Russian fascism in the present to focus on a future commercial relationship and the restarting of cooperation with Russia. That would be a little bit like Britain planning trade talks with Germany in late 1940 while the Battle of Britain rages. It's absolutely absurd thinking, if true. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has responded to a flurry of reports about who was responsible for blowing up Nord Stream pipelines in 2022 by calling for the initiators and patrons of the project that benefited Russia to apologize and keep quiet. Poland has come under particular scrutiny in recent days over the act of sabotage, which is being investigated by Germany, with a former head of Berlin's foreign intelligence agency, the BND, earlier this week claiming it could not have been carried out without Warsaw's support. German authorities issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian national in connection to the explosions of the Nord Stream pipelines, according to a media investigation by several German news outlets published on August 14th. The man, a diving instructor introduced simply as Volodymyr Z, was seen in a Polish town west of Warsaw, but has now gone into hiding, Die Zeit said. Perhaps someone has played a prank on them. Volodymyr Z? Really? Could this be the infamous Ukrainian sense of black humor and irony at work? In any case, the details that have been provided stretch credulity to breaking point, leading one to wonder why German media and the authorities would dive down this particular rabbit hole again. This would be the first arrest warrant issued in connection with the 2022 explosions at the gas pipelines connecting Germany with Russia via the Baltic Sea. The suspect's full name apparently is Volodymyr Zhoralov, age 44. He is suspected of an anti-constitutional sabotage and causing an explosion. The media investigation claimed that two other suspects, a man and a woman, are also Ukrainian citizens, but uncovered no evidence of the Ukrainian government's involvement. Kyiv has repeatedly denied connection to the Nord Stream blasts. The construction of Nord Stream 2, which began in 2018, came under heavy criticism from the US, Ukraine, and other European countries. The new gas pipeline threatened to deepen the energy dependence of the EU's leading economy on Russian gas and effectively create a new leverage for Moscow. Staying on the topic of misinformation and how readily some analysts and the press seem to gulp it up, the Kyiv Independent asks whether the Istanbul peace talks were a missed opportunity for Ukraine. The rumored talks were not even about a peace deal, but about the respect for internationally recognized rules of war and suspension of attacks on critical energy infrastructure by both combatants. But when has Russia respected the conventions of international law, despite being a permanent member of the UN Security Council? Rather, such talks have always been used by Moscow as a cover for more aggression or to limit or delay foreign support for Ukraine. Moscow's dismal track record with security agreements suggests that the 2022 Russia-Ukrainian peace talks in Istanbul were unlikely to succeed. Moscow's appalling history of honoring political and security agreements with former Soviet republics is some of the context that so many analysts and media outlets seem to ignore in their reporting and analysis. Hope seems to spring eternal amongst politicians and diplomats also, despite the conclusive historical evidence that Moscow cannot be trusted. Many analyses continue to naively assume the Kremlin would adhere to any signed deal, ignoring Russia's well-documented pattern of broken promises. Over the last 35 years, Russia has repeatedly demonstrated a disregard for legal agreements, often with tragic consequences. Key agreements between Moscow and Kyiv that were central to post-Soviet international relations have been breached time and time again. Rather, Moscow uses terroristic threats at every opportunity, as exemplified by this story. The first reaction of Russian forces to the Kursk offensive was to start a fire at the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. A reported fire at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, ZNPP, was likely started by the Russian military forces, who set fire to a large number of automobile tires in cooling towers. Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the head of the military administration in Nikopol, said on August 11th, citing sources across the river in occupied Energodar. Perhaps this is a provocation or an attempt to create panic in the settlements on the right bank of the former reservoir, he said. President Volodymyr Zelensky called on the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, to hold Russia accountable for the provocation. As long as Russian terrorists retain control of the nuclear power plant, the situation is not and cannot be normal, Zelensky said. We are waiting for the world's reaction, waiting for the IAEA's reaction. The Zaporizhia nuclear plant, Europe's largest nuclear power station, has been under Russian occupation since March 2022. Its position near the front has led to heightened nuclear safety risks throughout Russia's full-scale war. Projection and bullying, however, are central to the Russian playbook. In that spirit, Moscow is spreading claims about alleged Ukrainian plan to attack the Kursk nuclear plant. Russia's defense ministry claimed on August 17th that Ukraine is allegedly planning to attack the Kursk nuclear power plant in Russia, which was dismissed by Ukraine's foreign ministry out of hand. Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesman called these claims a surge of insane Russian propaganda. We officially refute these false reports. Ukraine has neither the intention nor the ability to carry out such actions. Russia must stop spreading dangerous lies, he said. Russia's defense ministry threatened to immediately take tough retaliatory military and military technical measures in case of the alleged attack on the Kursk power plant, claiming that Kyiv allegedly wants to blame Russia afterwards. Russia has previously claimed that Ukraine was developing a dirty bomb, a device that uses explosives to scatter radioactive waste, in 2022. After the inspection at Ukraine's request, the International Atomic Energy Agency experts found no indications whatsoever of undeclared nuclear activities and materials at the alleged locations. Nothing has changed since then. Ukraine has always been and remains a committed member of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. We do not have any dirty bombs and do not plan to acquire them, said Ukraine. But these stories of Russia's projection and threats raise questions also about the activities of Rosatom, which is not subject to the same punitive sanctions regime as other industries in Russia. Here is an interesting story in the Kyiv Independent about how the Russian nuclear giant Rosatom directed additional income through a Dutch subsidiary. Rosatom uses a Dutch subsidiary to move hundreds of millions of euros in profit, the Dutch media outlet NOS reported, citing a report from Rosatom's subsidiary, Uranium One Cooperative. Rosatom controls over 40% of the global uranium market and 17% of the international reactor fuel market. Rosatom's foreign order portfolio has been valued at $200 billion, and it includes the construction of over 20 nuclear reactors in various countries such as India, Turkey, and Egypt. The US Treasury imposed some sanctions on Rosatom last year, but the EU did not follow suit. According to NOS, through its Dutch subsidiary, Rosatom continues to actively extract raw materials in Kazakhstan and Tanzania. From those countries, the funds are routed through the Netherlands before being transferred to Russia. We aim to cover this topic in more detail in a special interview on Silicon Curtain because, to my mind, Rosatom is an entity that should be sanctioned to extinction. It remains one of the crown jewels in Russia's military economy and is an important source of revenue, leverage, and prestige for Putin's fascistic terror state. Finally, we'll end on a breaking story, which also contains a mixture of disinformation claims and counterclaims. No doubt we'll feature this story more in the next Silicon Bites. Ukraine's foreign ministry says reports on Germany halting military aid are manipulation. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung reported earlier on the same day that Germany's finance ministry was not planning to approve additional aid to Ukraine as part of budgetary savings this year. The newspaper cited obtained documents and emails from unnamed sources. According to the FAZ, Ukraine will receive previously approved assistance, but additional requests from the German Defense Ministry will not be supported. The reports that Germany is allegedly stopping military aid to Ukraine are incorrect. Georgi Tichy, a spokesman for Ukraine's foreign ministry, told Ukrainian news agency Ukrinform. This is the same kind of manipulation as the previous reports about Germany halving aid for the next year. Tichy said that the German budget is expected to be approved in November, and only then the level of support for Ukraine for next year will be known. We expect that the German government will find an opportunity to provide additional funding for the needs of Ukraine's defense forces this year as well, Tichy said. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung also reported that the possible freezing of new aid for Ukraine has led to a tangible dispute in the German government. Germany's budget for 2024 envisages military aid for Ukraine worth 8 billion euros, while the draft budget for 2025 includes only 4 billion euros in military aid for Ukraine. Well, we'll end here. But this story of German aid to Ukraine and the tensions within the ruling coalition that are potentially reaching breaking point is something we will look to cover in upcoming interviews and episodes.